الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. So if you remember, in the previous lesson and the lesson before that, we covered the first level, the first ranks of the books of Hadith. We covered the Muwatta of Imam Malik. The last lesson when we were here, we covered the Sahih of Bukhari and we covered the Sahih of Imam Muslim, very briefly. And after we had that lesson, if you remember, we spent some time talking about a Musnad of Hakim, if you remember. And on the group, I shared some notes afterwards. I went home and read some stuff. And then I actually included in here. I'm not going to go through it, but there's lots that's been written about the Mustadrak. I did share a PDF which had a chapter on the Mustadrak as well, which explains why the Mustadrak is not everything that people think it is. You know, if he used the same conditions as Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, then why did he come with different hadiths? And there's reasons for this as well. And I've shared lots of notes on it as well. So these are some notes that I made. I don't know if I shared all of this with you guys, but I did tweet it. I did share it on Twitter. And a few people private messaged me afterwards for the sources, but it was one of those nights I couldn't sleep, so I thought, you know what better to do than to just do some further reading. So but I share that for you guys as well on the group. What I want to do today is look at the second rank of books of Hadith very, very quickly. These are books ranking according to Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. So different scholars of Hadith, different scholars will have different ranks in terms of how they categorize books of Hadith. So Shah Waliullah says in his book, الطبقة الثانية كتب لم تبلغ مبلغ الموطأ والصحيحين. Books that haven't reached the ranks of the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and books that haven't reached the ranking of I'll make the Arabic bigger if I'm able to do that. There you go. Yeah. So كتب لم تبلغ مبلغ الموطأ والصحيحين. They haven't reached the level of Muwatta and Sahihin. ولكن تتلوها, but they come after them. Yeah, they sort of follow them closely behind. كان مصنفوها معروفين بالوثوق والعدالة, and their authors are known for their reliability, yeah, and their integrity, والحفظ, their memory. So these are like some of the conditions that he's listing. So to be able to narrate hadith, there are conditions, right? And so those conditions, for example, you have to be reliable, you have to have integrity, you have to have memory, right? وَالتَّبَحُّرْ فِي فُنُونِ الْحَدِيثِ, and you have to be deeply immersed in the sciences of hadith as well. So it's a mustaqil, it's a field in its own right as well. وَلَمْ يَرْضَى فِي كُتُبِ هَذِهِ بِالتَّسَاهُلِ فِيمَا اشْتَرَطُوا عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ, and they weren't satisfied in being lax. They were very strict as well. Maybe not as strict as the other authors that we've covered in the previous lessons, because their threshold was really high. And it makes sense, the higher the threshold, the less you can include, I guess, in some ways. The more lax you are as you move down, the more you can capture in terms of the narrators that you want to capture, or the hadith that you want to capture. Okay. فيما اشتروا على أنفسهم فتلقها من بعد بالقبول, and then people accepted it as well after them. So there's this idea that when we look at hadith, we obviously look at each narrator in the chain of narration, and we have conditions for each of them, but we also look at the ummah as a mass. Do they accept those books as well? So it's very common today as well, you know, when we look at a scholar, part of it is his own learning, integrity, his scholarship. And then we also look at how well received he is in the community as well. Sometimes we have that imbalance where we sort of, you know, we don't value scholarship that much, but really and here when we talk about, I guess when he's talking about the ummah accepting this, we're probably talking about the scholars accepting this, because in the average guy in the street, he won't know how authentic that is. So there was a video going on, I won't mention, he's a famous celebrity scholar if you like. He was delivering a dars. You might have seen this last week or the week before. It gave me the giggles. So he was basically telling the people in his community that, you know, there are mawzu hadith. There's a genre of weak hadith. Like people write about this, we'll cover it. So people have specific books that tell you that books in this, the hadith in these books are fabricated, just to let you know that they are. So he was telling them that, you know, these are fabricated hadiths, and he mentions one or two, I think, in the video, and the audience, they're all like, mashallah, wow, wow, shabash, shabash, you know, like, he's like, no, 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 I'm telling you, these are fabricated hadiths. So people just don't know. Like, you can tell them anything, and this is the situation that we're in. But when, I guess when Shah Walī is talking about the ummah, فَتَقَلَّهَا مِمَّنْ بَعْدَهُمْ بِالْقُبُولَ, people accepted their books, and we'll go through some of their books now. Okay, وَعَتَنَا بِهَا الْمُحَدِّثُونَ وَالْفُقَهَاء طَبْقَةً بَعْدَ تَقْوَى, and then the muhaddithi and the fuqaha have benefited from their books as well. It's interesting as well that he mentions the fuqaha and muhaddithin as two separate groups. So generally we say ulama, but when in you have to be more specific, because you have scholars, generally they are either really good in hadith or they're really good in fiqh. Rarely will you find a scholar who's really good in both, because they're really deep sciences. Okay, but he says that the fuqaha and the muhaddithin take these books, and many of their, when you look in Quduri again, inshallah, next week, and when we go back into it, you'll find many of them are in these books as well. So they're not always in Bukhari, they're not always in Muslim, they're not always in Muwatta, but you'll find them in other books as well. Okay, so that's important to bear in mind as well. Then he says, وَاشْتَهَرَ فِي مَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, it became popular amongst the people. وَتَعَلَّقَ بَعْدَ الْقَوْمِ شَرْحًا لِغَرِيبِهَا, and then people came after it, and what they did was they spent time looking at what's called the ghara'ib. Gharib or the ghara'ib is a specific terminology when a hadith, for example, rests on the authority of only one companion. Okay, so this is like a terminology. We call it gharib, but it's usually here unusual hadiths, or those where it's only come through one companion. You know, one companion first after the Prophet ﷺ, there was only one, so they look into it as well. Okay, so this is something to bear in mind. وَتَعَلَّقَ بِهَا الْقَوْمُ شَرًا لِغَرَابِهَا وَفَحْصًا عَنْ رِجَالِهَا, and they look at the people, they look into each of the people that transmit the hadith from all generations. Okay, and then so here investigating that chain of transmitters. Okay, deriving rulings from them, such that the general science religion are based upon them. So many of the ulum are taken from the second tabqa. Okay, we've done this to death now, I think, over the last year, about why we don't just take hadith from Bukhari and Muslim only, right? People just don't understand how history works, how the development of fiqh works. They don't understand how even hadith works, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. I think most of you now should be confident. If someone was to say to you, well, I'm only going to act upon hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, you could have a cup of coffee with them, literally, and have a conversation with them and explain to them that that's not how it works, right? And that's a big problem, because that's a very simple way of looking at your tradition. So anyway, this is what it says. وَإِسْتَنْبَاطًا لِفِقْهِ, they take rulings from it, right? So here, وَإِسْتِنْبَاطًا لِفِقْهَ, from the hadith, they take out. Istinbat actually comes from the word button, ba, ta, and nun. Button means stomach, yeah. So they take out, literally like taking out from the animal the stomach, like literally taking out what's inside, and they're able to take out from the statements of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam deep meanings that me and you would never have thought about. We just read the translation, and we wouldn't think there's something to be taken from there. Okay, and then he says, وعلى تلك الأحاديث بناء عامة العلوم, and he mentions the books as well. كسنن Abu Dawud, right? Sunan Abu Dawud is mentioned there. Jami' al-Tirmidhi, the Jami' of Imam Tirmidhi. These are books that you're familiar with. And he mentions the Mujtaba of Nasa'i, Imam Nasa'i. These are three books that are mentioned here in particular. And these are taught in the Darul Uloom Dars Nizami as well. Okay, so they make up the corpus of the studies that we go into in Darul Uloom as well. So he mentions them three by name. وهذا الكتاب مع طبقة الأولى اتنا بحديث. Okay, so so he mentions these books, and the hadith of these books together with those of the first rank are given attention, and he mentions some names as well as there as well. So the first one, Imam Abu Dawud, I'll just mention them very briefly about him. You've come across, you've heard of Abu Dawud Sharif, right? We mention it all the time. Not everything in there is obviously authentic, and that's why you need to then look into it. But nowadays, you have commentaries on these books. and you have many now who, mashallah, who have written about the authenticity or otherwise of the text as well. So Abu Dawood, his full name is Abu Dawud Sulaiman bin Ash'ath al-Sijistani, rahimahullah. He died in 275 Hijri. That's his Sunan. Okay. The next one is Abu Isa Muhammad bin Isa Tirmizi, rahimahullah. He died in 279, so around the same period. And obviously his book here is the Sunan Tirmizi, the one that we're all acquainted with. And then you have Imam Abdul Rahman Ahmad bin Shu'aib Nasa'i, rahimahullah. He died 303 Hijri. Okay, and he has a book called Mujtaba. Some people call it Sunan Nasa'i. Some people also call it Sunan al-Sughra. So the most famous title we give is Nasa'i, but it's also sometimes referred to as Sunan al-Sughra. That's the same text. Okay.
What's like a technical difference between, like, is there a difference between Sunan and Jami' and Mujtaba and Musnad?
Yeah, there is. So I think I've mentioned it here somewhere for you guys. So a Musnad, if you look at a footnote, is according to the names of the transmitters. Sanad. They arrange it according to names of the transmitters. So this is all from this transmitter. These are all from this transmitter.
So that's how it's collected.
That's how it's collected. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So
Jami is basically, the Jami is where it's basically on all the topics. So yeah, it's topical. Tahara, wuzu, ghusl, iman.
So the Jami' of Bukhari, Muslim,
Yeah, they or Tirmizi, for example. So if you open up Imam Tirmizi's book, it's worth just googling this if you ever get time. Yeah, just having a look at the content. Jami will have Kitab al-Tahara, Kitab al-Salah, Kitab al-Sawm. The hadith will be collected according to topic, whereas in the Musannaf, in the Musnad, it's just according to the names of the transmitters. So that's also very useful because you can check references and stuff. And then the final type you have, or one of the other types you have, is called a Musannaf, which is very similar, but it's according to different chapters as well. Because they have chapters on various things as well.
So what's the difference between a Musannaf and
A Jami is there's no real difference as such.
doesn't Musannaf include the chain of narration? Or
Yeah.
is that what the difference is?
Musannaf also has a chain of narration. The Jami does, but not always. And the Jami sometimes, like if you look at Imam Tirmizi's Jami, he doesn't always include the entire hadith.
Okay.
So if you look in Tirmizi, what he'll do is he'll just put in the part of the hadith that's relevant to our discussion.
Okay.
So you'll get a hadith in Jami' Tirmizi. If you look at the hadith, is very short. They're very short, and that's why it's a good teaching text. It's a good text to read because it's like very short. If you look at Imam Bukhari's text, he has an entire hadith in there, full hadith. Whereas Imam Tirmizi says, this is on Tahara, and he only talk about a relevant part of Tahara as an example. Okay.
Could you
Go on.
just go through the names again? So
Yeah, I can. So
Sulaiman.
Abu Dawud Sulaiman bin Ash'ath with a Tha at the end, Sijistan. Died in 275.
Yeah.
Then you have Imam Abu Isa Muhammad bin Isa Tirmizi from Tirmiz, died in 279, rahimahullah. Then you have Imam Abdul Rahman Ahmad bin Shu'aib Nasa'i, who died in 303 Hijri.
Abdul Rahman.
Ahmad bin Shu'aib Nasa'i. So this is the second rank of books of hadith. Okay, the third rank, وَالطَّبْقَةُ الثَّالِثَةُ. Okay, طبقة الثالثة. I'll just quickly do the ranking here. So I've written all down for you. I'm happy to send you this separately if you want to, so you don't have to write it down. So these were written either before, during, or after Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. Okay. So the first one is the Musnad of Abu Ali, also known as Abu Ya'la bin Ali Mawsili. Okay, I've put their dates according to Hijri calendar. With some footnotes. Let me see what footnotes say. Yeah, that's fine. The next one is Musannaf Abdul Razak, very famous. Okay, and in the brackets I've just put the detail bin Hammam San'ani. The third one is Abu Bakr Abdullah, who's also known as Ibn Shaybah. So you must have heard of Musannaf Ibn Abi Shaybah. Very famous, yeah. Musannaf Ibn Abi Shaybah. Some like they've not been some haven't been printed as such. They're still in manuscript form or they need a lot of work. I'm reading a book at the moment, copy here. This one, which talks about how much still are lagging in libraries of Cairo and Istanbul, but also in European libraries as well now. So we need Muslims to learn Arabic and spend some time and bringing these books, bringing these manuscripts to life. There's literally thousands of books that are just lying there gathering dust, and that's people think that we've lost them, but then we found them. And only in the last 200-300 years there's been a boom in publishing of classical texts. Before that, because we never had mass printing, and people, when they read books, it was very kind of like a specific audience, a very narrow focus, and people just studied the same books really. They didn't really branch out much. But when Orientalists started to come into the Muslim lands, they took a lot of these manuscripts away, and they're locked up in people's homes somewhere, rich people's homes, or they've donated them to Oxford, Cambridge, or Princeton, or wherever. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of, and lots of these books people thought they were missing, but now we have them on PDF. Like everybody's got a copy of it, people read them. So alhamdulillah, there's been thanks largely to the technology of print, a lot of these books have come into the public domain. There's a lot more work to be done in terms of manuscripts and reading through books. So there's been a lot of young people now, at least some friends I know are interested in this field now, so they're training. A Maulana friend in America wrote a short risala on how, in English, I'll share it with you guys, of how to work with manuscripts. So if you ever have a hobby, and it's a hobby you want to do, go to libraries and just spend a weekend with your family, but also grab some manuscripts or work with some manuscripts. It's a really good khidmat. There are ulama who do PhDs and just work in manuscripts, trying to find all the different editions and correcting it. So anyway, this is something that needs to be done as well. So you have Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah rahimahullah. The next one is where is it on number 4 is Abd bin Humayd Abd Qissi rahimahullah. Qis is like, it's a place near Samarkand. Yeah, so that's why it's called Qissi. That one, it seems that we don't have it, or it's not been printed, or it's in manuscript form. It still needs work. So that one's not it's not been printed as such. Okay.
So is this one that Shah himself had access to, but
so what happens is sometimes they don't have access to it, but it's mentioned in the books. It's referenced in the books.
okay. So we know it exists through references.
Yeah. So people mention I read in this book, and so, but no one actually has the actual book, or someone does have it, but it's not been printed.
Okay.
Because you have to remember that up until recently in the Muslim world, the only way you get a copy of a book is you sit with the sheikh, and you get like one of his students, you'd copy his text.
So would you say it's similar to how the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq is, in that we know that it exists, we just don't have it,
yeah.
copy of it.
It's been lost or whatever. But normally that would be what happened. So you'd come from another country, for example, and you say, no, I heard that you've got this text. There's no photocopying or printing, so okay, fine, you want to study it, copy it out. So it's a painstaking process. Or you pay someone, you copy the text out for me, and then you'd read it in front of you'd read it in front of the sheikh, and the sheikh would just you hear in Mauritania, for example, the sheikh's lying down, he's just chilling, and he's just listening to you read this entire book, and he's just correcting your mistakes, and they give you ijazah at the end. There's different ways of getting ijazah. You don't have to formally study the text, you could have just read it in front of him. He'll give you ijazah. This is there's different ways you can get ijazah from teachers as well. So that's the other one. The next one is Abu Dawood Sulaiman bin Dawood al-Tayalisi. Tayalisi, okay. Basri is also called Basri. The next one is Ahmad bin Hussein Bayhaqi. Yeah. And then he has a number of texts. So you've heard of Bayhaqi, I hope. So he has As-Sunan al-Kubra. He has a kitab called As-Sunan al-Sughra. And then he has a number of other ones, Al-Musannaf fi Shu'ab al-Iman. And you'll probably see this in footnotes, like the people when they reference them. So that sometimes you'll find that one mentioned maybe in Fazal Amal or something. Yeah. And so these are other ones as well. And then you have Abu Ja'far Ahmad bin Muhammad Tahawi. If you remember, he came up in one of our lessons when we were talking about hadithification of fiqh, and he started off as a Shafi'i, if I remember, but alhamdulillah he converted to Hanafism afterwards. Okay. So Tahawi is very, very famous. His famous book is Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar al-Mukhtalifati al-Marwiyati an Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. His most famous known as Ma'ani al-Athar. So he brings hadith, and a lot of times it's to support Hanafi school. Okay. Then you have Sulaiman bin Ahmad Tabrani. You've heard of Tabarani, I hope as well. He has Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, which is a famous book. He also has a Mu'jam al-Saghir as well. And then he also has Al-Mu'jam al-Wasi. Big, small, middle. Yeah. So he has that as well. Okay. So this is the books. All of those ones that we mentioned just now, they collected whatever was around. They weren't so concerned with refining them. This is the difference between the first, second, and the third category. So they just collected what was around. They weren't so much concerned in refining. That's why we need to. That's why when you get these books, you have to be aware that you need to look at what the scholars have said about the hadith in those books. Does that make sense? So like when you read Fazal A'mal and someone comes up to you and says, we read this hadith. It happens here as well. And as soon as they mention these, you know that alarm bells ringing. You don't just comment upon it. You've got to go and dig it up and say what the scholars have said on it. Fortunately, that's not that difficult to do now. So they didn't refine them. They didn't even look at the ones. They didn't say that you can act upon this, you can't act upon this. They were just collecting them. They just collected them. And perhaps our husn zan is that it's still a good job to be done, right? It's important to collect them. And they left it for other people to go through the task of sifting them, because it's quite a job collecting things in of itself, and then it's quite a job sifting through all of that as well. Okay, so they combine sound, good, weak hadith, recognized hadith, uncommon hadith, anomalous hadith, objectionable hadith, even erroneous ones. So they collected them, right? And we have to go through them, and things that were transposed and so forth as well. Okay, so so this requires, when you read these books, you obviously read them with a pinch of salt, literally, yeah. But they're still important. I mean, you don't throw away the entire book. You go through the effort of trying to work out what's going on. Fortunately, a lot of work has been done on these books now, so you don't have to work that hard. You just have to look at the commentaries on them, and the scholars of hadith will tell you what their grading is and so forth and so on. Okay, the fourth one is that they were collected after a long period of time, and they're not found in the first two ranks, and they were brought to life to being obscure. So they were quite obscure books that came in the fourth rank. Okay. These books have really weak hadith in them. So he mentions al-sinata man lam yaktub hadith al-muhaddithun kathir min al-wa'ad. So it's very well known. This is very interesting, by the way, that public speakers classically they would fabricate a lot. Jabbering preachers. It's well known. So they would use weak hadith. They would fabricate things just to get people really excited. MashaAllah, shabash, Allah, Allah, like this sort of So it's not like a modern thing today that the public preachers do this, right? So people say, oh, astaghfirullah, this sheikh made this hadith up. Sometimes they're not fabricated. They might just be mentioning them because of fazail. And anyway, they're not muhaddithin anyway. Most you don't really get an academic who's going to become a public speaker, generally speaking, unless they're very talented, mashallah. So careless speakers, heretics, unreliable people, Shah Walī calls them. Okay. Sometimes it was mixed up, and what happened was it was something a Sahabi said, but people attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. This happens quite a lot, by the way. It's a common error. So they say Prophet ﷺ said this, and then you look in the Hadith, it says no, the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Huraira said that. Right. So when you're reading books of Hadith, just be aware that did the Prophet say, or did a companion say, or did someone of the Salaf say? So that's called mawquf and munqati. Mawquf means it stops waqf with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. Sometimes you also have this is very common as well from the Bani Israeliyat riwayats as well. Yeah. Aw min akhbar Israel. So you have a lot of Israelites riwayat. I mean, there's a whole discussion around can you take these pre-Islamic discussions, can you take them into Islam? And the ulama generally say that it's fine as long as you make it clear. But what happens is people take in biblical narratives and they transpose them or they apply them to Islam. So they might be looking for something, they can't find anything, so they say, oh, well, the Bani Israel used to say this. So, but it's important that you clarify that this is not from Islamic tradition, this is from Bani Israel tradition as well. Because there may be some truth in what they've narrated, right? But we don't build our belief, our ibadat, or our aqaid on what we receive from the Bani Israeliyat. And you sometimes hear scholars saying this, like this guy made this up, like it's Israeli, like he heard it from somebody, and it's not from our tradition. There's also other reasons, because if you remember in early Islam, a lot of people were converts. A lot of them were scholars of Judaism, Christianity, or even other religions besides them. As the Islamic Empire grew, many of these people were scholars. They'd have some familiarity, or when they came across something in the Quran and Sunnah, they were like, oh, we've got something similar in our tradition. And so people weren't careful in sifting it. It's very common, like if you think about it today, sometimes we bring things from our past into the scholarship, but we don't really mention it because we just think because we'll know like this is from the Bani Israel or this is from the Bible. But as time goes by, what happens sometimes is it kind of becomes like truth almost. So it's very, very important to bear this in mind as well. Then he says, "Aw min kalam al-hukama." So these are the ways that they can creep into hadith genre, or like from philosophers, wal wa'ad, who mixed mistakenly or deliberately hadith with other translators. So they mix things up, right? And this does happen. There are many examples even today, like a scholar written something, and he made a mistake, a genuine mistake, and then because people don't do tahqiq, they don't research, they don't go back to the primary source, what happens? It just gets repeated, and then like it just becomes like every next. And then what happens is you have, even now in the last few centuries, scholars have gone back and said, well, actually, we found an original source, and the original source doesn't say that. It was a copy error, because it can happen. Or even now, when they make when they turn manuscripts into books, they can very easily. I mean, there's certain publishing houses that are well known. If you're into this field, that are known for making errors in their typing, because remember they don't typing it all up. They type. That's all they do, bichara, like that's their job. And then usually someone reads it back to them, but it's easy. Human errors can easily creep in.
Mistaken or deliberate errors.
Yeah, mistaken, deliberate. That's why you have to be really, really into scholarship to spot these things. Like this doesn't make sense. Like nuktas, like the dots and stuff. You get them in the wrong place. Letter here and there. Gharaib. And then just on Saturday, I was having a discussion with my teacher. Gharaib to gharaib, two different meanings. Gharaib, just the bag goes, turns into a meme. You change the meaning. There's a discussion of it. It was a fiqh discussion, but like it has impact if you're not in that field, right? أو كان من محتملات القرآن والحديث صحيح, interpretation from the Quran or Hadith with certain pious people who inadvertently took them as Hadith from Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So sometimes what happens is like someone makes a comment on the Quran or Hadith, right? It's a comment on it, but what happens is, so the pious people, they say, oh, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said this. Does that make sense? The Prophet didn't say that. That's your interpretation of God's words or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with, and that often happens as well. So it's interesting. He uses. I'm kind of just looking to text it a bit. And, qawmun salihun. Yeah, it's really interesting because Shah Walī is saying pious people. قوم صالحون لا يعرفون غوامض الرواية. Like they were good people, and this is important because we differentiate between piety itself and ulum, knowledge and hifz, right? Just because someone's pious doesn't mean they're knowledgeable. There's a really important distinction. The muhaddithin were like, you know what, they're really pious people, for example, but we won't take hadith from them because they're not known for memory, they're not known for being exact in their memory. We won't take hadith from them. It's really important. Like, a lot of people nowadays don't understand this. Just because someone's pious doesn't mean that they're knowledgeable. Does that make sense? Yeah, like they might be, mashallah, they might be narrating things and they might be giving durus, or they might be a lovely public speaker, really moves the crowd, but that doesn't necessarily make them a scholar. In Islamic scholarship, in our tradition, we're not interested. Piety is important, but your memory is important. Your ability to retain things accurately is important. These things are important because we are transmitting something for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's significant for us. Of course, you should be pious and knowledgeable at the same time, but there's lots of people out in our own communities who are very pious, mashallah, but they're not scholars, or they might know a certain level of knowledge. Beyond that, they're not really trained. That's important to be aware of. Okay, people say, oh, mashallah, he's so knowledgeable because he's a good public speaker. Well, we don't take our knowledge from public. We don't make our tradition from public speakers. We take it from people who are scholars. Scholarship is very, very important. Okay, and this still happens today. This isn't like a pre-modern thing. Even today, people will fabricate hadith. You'll hear them being mentioned everywhere. The best way is what the Salaf used to do. They never used to attribute to Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were careful about attributing to Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Because they didn't want to fall under the remit of that hadith where Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that whoever says something about me which is not true, they should make their place in the fire of Jahannam. Right? So we should be careful about uttering something from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or at least at the end say, as we do, "O kama qala alayhi salatu wasallam," or like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, or you just stick to the well-known traditions. Okay. So this is what happens as well. أو كانت جملا شتى في حديث مختلف جعلوا حديثا واحدا بنسق واحد. Or sometimes what happens is they're like sentences from different hadith and they make it into one hadith. It's a mishmash, and people make it into one. So he's just giving you examples of why and how this might happen as well. So this rank includes at best those hadiths which are weak. So most of them are going to be weak. And you'll also have in this category those that are mawdu. And then he also mentions in the text itself where he gives examples of books where you can find this as well, but I'm not going to go into the names of them. Okay? Yeah, I'm not going to go into the names of them for in the interest of time. The fifth rank is those which are those which cannot be considered from the hadith collection. They're not hadith at all. Okay? Like it happens quite a lot. So you've heard this famous hadith, "Utlubul ilm walau bis-Sin." Yeah, seek knowledge even from China. That's not a hadith, but it's become very popular amongst people. The ma'na, the meaning is like correct, like this idea of seeking knowledge. So I've read like an academic who mentioned this in his book. So I knew him, so I emailed him. I said, look, he's not a Muslim, but I said, look, with all due respect, this is not actually a hadith. It's a common phrase that people use. So then we say these things, and we say the Prophet ﷺ said this, the Prophet ﷺ said this. So it can happen where things just become very popular, and people start attributing to Prophet ﷺ. So he says among ulama, Sufis, and historians. So a lot of historians will say something, and then people will just take it as a hadith. Sufis will say something, and people will take it as a statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And legal scholars sometimes, the fuqaha might say something and it becomes understood as a hadith, but it's not. This is why sometimes you have to do a little bit of research and not always take things at face value, because these things can happen, right? And so, generally when you're speaking or delivering a dars or you're teaching, you try and train your students to check things out. like, okay, it's mentioned in this kitab, just check it out, is it in that kitab, right? And it's important to do these things, tahqiq, like this idea of, it's like what you do at university, right? You check your references, you check it, is that actually what it is, right? So very, very important. So he mentions people that would do this. So he says here, وَمِنْهَا مَا دَسَّهُ الْمَاجِنْ فِي دِينِ, people who are like insolent about their religion, like they're careless about their religion, right? So sometimes they even know Arabic and they invent chains, right, that are difficult to track. So you have to be really, really good at science to be able to work it out. People sometimes do this for various reasons, political reasons, because they follow a certain sect and they want hadith to support their sect, for example, or like you want to support a particular sultan who's a leader at the time, and you want to say, well, people who have these attributes, the Prophet said this, like people who have these attributes are worthy of become leaders. And you can imagine this because in early Islam there was a lot of fighting as well, it was infighting, and people use hadith in different ways to support their political agendas. Yeah. And so this can happen. And so even eloquent saying, sometimes you have something which is like something sounds beautiful and it must be from the Prophet ﷺ, but it's not actually from the Prophet ﷺ. He didn't actually say that. So it's very, very important that we teach our children, we learn ourselves, that we always check out things. Right? We don't just forward things, hadith on from the Prophet ﷺ, or things that have been shared, oh, this is a wonderful hadith. We actually check it out. It's difficult because most of us are not trained in this science. So what we then do is we go to the commentaries, or we ask people and say, you know what, we need to check this out. Okay? But he says here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created jahabidha min ahli hadith, people who are excellent, their minds are very sharp, and they investigate these ahadith and they expose their flaws. Okay? So very, very, very quickly, from the 5 ranks, the first rank is we trust them, yeah, in terms of the hadiths that are in there. So Bukhari, Muslim, Muwatta, Imam Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood. However, like I mentioned before, about the second rank, they require a little bit more effort. Just you got to check, because not everything in Abu Dawood or Imam Tirmidhi's book is authentic in of itself. Okay, we're not going to go into the detail. The third rank of hadith that we mentioned are for those people who know what they're talking about, essentially. Okay, so they're able to find defects in chains, and you can use those hadiths to support things. But remember, if you can use the Quran, you stick to the Quran. If you can use Sahih hadith, you use Sahih hadith. And then you use different levels. So we don't negate hadith altogether. When you're gathering evidence to support your conclusions, you always try, like the Hanafis, we said, we use the Quran as much. Now we have mutawatir, we have ahad. So these things are important, because sometimes you might not even find anything in those categories. Then you have to go to the third level. Yeah. And the fourth rank, he says, has very little benefit in terms of gathering evidence. Right. So fourth rank, you don't really use that, and it makes sense. You know, if you've got Sahih hadith, you've got Bukhari, Muslim, you've got Quran, you've got all of these other forms, then you will stick to them as well. But remember what we said in the previous lessons around we use hadith, but we also use our brains, literally speaking. Right? We think about stuff. Like, does that actually make sense? Who said it? And so what we do is we use our rational faculties, and you've seen that in Hanafi school with revelation. So revelation and reason always work together, at least in the Hanafi school, as you've seen. So we talked about, so we're just very quickly pondering upon this, when we talked about Sunnah. Remember Sunnah, Mustahab? And we spend lots of time just thinking about Sunnah in terms of, how close does the Sunnah complete the Farz, Ikmal al-Farz. Right? Like there's this idea that where we have hadith, of course, we have Quran, of course, but we also try to make sense, like, the 4 fara'is are these 4 things: washing the face, the hands, including the elbows, the feet, and doing massa. So what about wiping the ears? What about the nape? Right? How closely does that resemble the ikmal of the farz? And obviously, the more close it is, the more it would be in terms of its credit rating as coming up in the Sunnah. So the Hanafis use rational methods as well to try and understand these things. So Walī used hadith, but they were also very rational. But they also looked at what practice they had received as well from the early generations. So what are people doing? Right? And that's a good measure of authenticity as well, because if everybody's doing it, there must be some basis for it as well. So we're not only just a textual tradition, we look at text and evidence, we're also a rational tradition, so we use our brains, which is something that's missing nowadays, right? People don't, like, people come with mas'alas and like, I'm like, why are you doing that? Oh, we just saw people doing it in the past, or like, we just heard about someone doing this. I'm like, well, do you not think about it? Do you not actually sit down and think, you know what, does this make sense in the masjid today? Do we need to do this today? So sometimes we need to think things through as well, because the religion is there to, it makes sense. The Sharia makes sense. It's an ethical system, and we are Maturidis in our theology, one of the schools of theology. And in Maturidis, this is a separate lesson altogether, a separate module altogether on terms of theology. And I think people should study theology, especially if you want to be a good Hanafi, because we're very strong on our theology, as you've probably seen in some of the lessons. And we place a lot of emphasis on the rational faculties, in the sense that, for example, is a person accountable? I don't know if you had this discussion. If a person is accountable without revelation, so say you lived and there was no prophet that came, could you still be held accountable? The Ash'aris will say no, until a prophet comes. What's the verse in the Quran that we don't punish anyone except when we send a prophet? What's the verse? مَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. So they take that proof, but the Maturidis have their own proof, and they say no, a person can work out good and evil rationally, without the need of revelation, right? And so therefore you can be held accountable. So even if a prophet didn't come, you're able to actually work out that God exists. Like, that's at least the minimum. And nobody can stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment and say, well, you know what, nobody told me that there was one God. Because it's possible Allah will say to them, well, you had your entire life, you had a brain, you were intelligent enough, you had time to watch movies, you had time to enjoy life, you didn't have the time, you couldn't find the time to think about the cosmos, right? So we say that no, you have that ability, fitra. Allah Rasul says that famous hadith that everyone's born upon fitra, but their parents make them a Jew or a Christian, remember? Right? So why is here? Fitra is not Islam. People say you're born about Islam. You're not born with Islam. You're born with the ability to recognize God, to recognize the oneness of God. Minimum. If a person spends time, he'll come to that conclusion, that he should come to that conclusion that Allah exists and there is a God. Because that's the minimum that's expected of a person. And what's called moral ontology or natural law, right? This idea that we can work out good and evil rationally. Like, everybody agrees that killing is wrong. It's where do we get that from? Even if you're an atheist, where did you get that from? If you're an atheist, why do you say evil? Why do you say killing is? Where did you get that? Where did you get that? Where did you get that ethical understanding from? Because if you don't believe in God, then where does your epistemology come from? Where does your truth and morality come from? We see we have the Quran that tells us that killing is wrong, right? Or the Sunnah tells us killing is wrong. But we can also work it rationally. But if they don't have any source of guidance, then where did you get these things from? So this is why it's important to bear in mind as well that in our school we give the aql its rightful place as well. We don't elevate it too much, but we give it a rightful place because it works together with revelation. And I hope in the last year that you've been studying, inshallah, you've understood this to a certain level. I mean, Zubair's doing a bit of mantiq with me as well, logic, right? It's important. Logic is important because we have to think things through, right? But at the same time, we give revelation its place as well, and we give Quran its place as well. We try and work in such a way that all of them come together. So inshallah, we'll end that. And then I won't go more for now. I mean, the next discussion by Shah Sahib is how, when the Prophet says something, what's the implications of it? So like when you hear Prophet say that if people don't come for Salah, burn their houses down. You literally burn people's houses down. So if Zubair didn't turn up for Fajr or something, right? Do I go and burn his house down? right? Like what does it mean when he says these things? And so a lot of people don't understand these things. So is it because it's a form of literally speech where when you're being verbose, like you're trying to say basically that you don't miss salah, like, or is it just you literally burn people's houses now? So these are this is something that we might do some other time, inshallah, where the Prophet ﷺ says something or Allah says something. So for example, وَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْءَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. Allah has permitted buying and selling and forbidden usury. Okay. So though it is not explicitly stated as buying and selling and usury or generally, the utterance conveys a meaning that it cannot have any other meaning. So this is like you go into things about when Allah says something, when وَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْءَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. What does it mean that He's made riba a haram? What does it mean? And He has made buying and selling permissible. What does it mean when Allah says this? So these are really important because you go into language of the Quran. It's really, really important that people understand these things, because otherwise, you have all these literalists who take the Quran on face value. فَقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمُوهُم. Kill all the polytheists where you find them. وَخُذُوهُم وَاحْصُرُوهُم. Like, but what does it actually mean? The context, but also the words of the Prophet ﷺ, or words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What do they actually mean? This is why you need to know language quite well. We'll stop there, inshallah. Next week.